Hello there everyone, and welcome to another episode of FiST Chat, the vodcast that features discussions on the topics of film, science and technology. My name is Ben Warner, and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern as we do this special episode to commemorate Steve Jobs and show tribute to him after his passing just the last few days. So, it's a bit of a sad day in the tech world and probably the world in general, really, isn't it? Given the impact that he's had.
I sad, everyone. I sad.
Yeah, it's a bit amazing that he's kind of like the type of person that you'd imagine would always be around, to come up with the next new thing that we're all clamoring for. And he's certainly changed the way we've looked at and used technology, hasn't he, Steve?
Well, he's gone up into the cloud now, so I think he'll always have a huge influence on certainly probably the next 10 years of computing or personal computing. I don't know if we can use those terms anymore.
Yeah.
Based applications on mobile devices. He, as we'll talk about shortly, for 40 years, he's, done an amazing job of, really transforming and taking that vision that he had, to all of us. So all of us got a lot more, I guess, out of our computing experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess maybe if we do a quick little snapshot of exactly what he gave us, going all the way back, starting with the Apple I and II computers, wasn't it? It was really the light bulb moment. I think he said for him was when he saw the idea of a graphical user interface, and that's really where he's sort of spearheaded things along as far as where we sit today, because obviously that's where all PCs and computers and iPhones, iPods, iPads, they all have a graphical user interface.
Well, that's it, and it's very interesting. There's a couple of things that are very interesting about that, which I didn't know, but Steve Jobs was actually one of the first employees at Atari.
Oh, yes.
And that's where he, I think, did a tour of the Xerox building and found the UI, which eventually transformed into the Macintosh. And the interesting thing with that was, he didn't buy that technology. He saw it and adapted it and worked out how to use it down the track. But I've got a really interesting quote from him, and this goes back to I think the Apple I or the Apple II. I'm not sure exactly where it fits in, but it's quite interesting. So he and Steve Wozniak, and Wozniak I think was maybe the technical drive, where Steve Jobs probably saw the application and the support. And he actually said once that with this idea, they went to Atari and they said, "Hey, we've got an amazing thing, even built with some of your parts. And what do you think about funding us? We'll even give it to you. We just want to do it. Pay our salary and we'll come and work for you." And Atari said no. And then they went to Hewlett-Packard, and Hewlett-Packard said, "Hey, we don't need you. You haven't even got through college yet."
There you go. Another oversight, another corporate oversight there, and he ended up. They ended up doing it themselves in the end, really.
Well, they did. Apple I, obviously, in the garage. Apple II was, a commercial computer, and I remember, being at high school, and we had an Apple II Plus. It's the pinnacle of computing.
Absolutely.
It was the pinnacle of computing.
Yeah. And if we move forward, it was it 1984 that it really there was that real breakthrough with the actual Macintosh computer as well. With I can't remember the name of it, but have you got that there or
the forerunner?
Yeah.
To Macintosh. Well, the forerunner to the Macintosh was the Lisa. So they went to an Apple IIe, and then I think they did an Apple III. Then they were trying to develop the Lisa, which didn't quite work out, and then the Macintosh was born. But the hallmarks of both of those, of course, were the famous Mac OS X, OS at that stage, which I think was OS 5 or 6.
Right. Yeah. And that of course had the famous Ridley Scott ad that promoted it at the I think it was only shown once at the Super Bowl apparently, to great fanfare.
That's all you need to show.
And that's probably another great example to explain Steve Jobs's his marketing prowess as well. That he kind of did it well with a bit of flair and got everyone excited about it. That unveiling of the in 1984 where they showed I've got those great clips on YouTube where they it's speaking and it's also doing some sort of cursive writing on the screen. I'm sure back then it would have been amazing.
Well, it was. I even remember the first time I came across the Macintosh at uni. In those days, Apple had really pushed very heavily into the education sector, and I think that actually ended up being many years on when Apple were in real trouble in the 90s. The only sector that still really was running their products were the universities, and even at that stage, they were switching off Apple simply because of the turmoil at a board level. But so I came across the Macintosh, and I've never seen anything like it. I've been used to having to program computers to make them work, or using DOS commands.
Yeah.
There was this thing. There was a mouse. At that stage, no PC actually had a mouse. In fact, I don't know what year it was, but it was at least 4 years until PCs brought in mouses after the Macintosh. So that just, for those of you who aren't as old as me, that just goes to show you how advanced they were. Can you imagine using a computer without a mouse and without a touch screen?
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
And because I also remember too, obviously it wasn't around Steve Jobs' time, but when I was in high school, this was in the period where he had been forced out and all that. But I remember we still had some Apple computers in our high school that we used, and there was definitely a marked difference between them and the PC ones we were using that were in a separate room across the lot. So, and they were very fascinating to use. But if we move forward, then obviously he got forced out, and then he came back, and Apple was in dire straits before he came back. And again, this kind of is testament to just how brilliant the guy was, that he turned the whole thing around relatively quickly, you would think, after he came back, and just started innovating and becoming the leader in terms of what to expect from a good quality computer.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it's ever been made clear what happened in that time, but I think part of the reason that he could turn Apple around so quickly was because they were still probably running off a lot of his ideas. During that time, as I said, when Apple really started to struggle, and I myself at that stage, Apple was a niche market. If you had an Apple, people use some sort of fruitcake. You can pirate software for it. You can't, do all these things that everyone was doing on their PCs. But, the flip side was that, if you had an Apple, you didn't have to rebuild your system every 6 months, and you didn't have to, buy a new computer every 9 months because the one you had just wasn't compatible or wouldn't work with anything. It was, but I remember at that point that people were really starting to switch off Apple because the products weren't good.
Yeah.
They'd stalled in terms of their development of obviously the Steve Jobs vision. Their hardware was still excellent. And that's why I tend to think that him coming back in, and he actually made a few quotes around the time that he had a plan for Apple and he could turn them around in no time at all, just before he got back on board with them. And he did. So I suspect that there's a very good lesson in that, and it's testimony to Steve Jobs that you can have great hardware, probably even great people working on that hardware and software, but to actually make it functional, requires somebody who really, is capable of having a vision and implementing it.
So just before we move on to this, I guess is the last period of brilliance where he probably gave us arguably some of his best touches there. It's probably worth mentioning that in that period that he was away from Apple, that he created the company Next, and also was instrumental in Pixar's development, which often goes overlooked in terms of his influence, because at the end of the day, even though he bought Pixar with an interest in the technology, he had really a lasting effect on the movies that were produced by that company, and it kind of goes along the lines of how he approached producing the computers and all of that sort of thing, which was, he told those guys, take as long as you need, but just make sure that it comes out great, which is pretty much a philosophy that you can see it apply to all of anything that he's ever touched, really.
Well, what an amazing must have been in California. Straight out of the 60s into the 70s, anything was possible. I mean, you could build a computing company in your garage, and then you could, go and buy, a company from George Lucas, who at the time was specialising in old-style special effects, miniature models, and miniature explosions and, fishing line and all sort of stuff. And, he started building the hardware and then the software and created, through that, the ability for Hollywood to produce some of the best films, even though they're animated, still some of the best that they've ever produced.
Absolutely. And just to round out everything is obviously these last 10 years, probably, even though obviously there was the development of the iMac, which was one of the things that really kicked off when he came back, but really exploded with the iPod in 10 years ago. And that's where it's the trend towards these devices, mobile devices that you could bring with you everywhere. The idea that you could, at the time it's easy to forget this, but at the time the idea of bringing around your entire music collection in something the size of a business card, or maybe a little bit bigger than that, but it was quite revolutionary at the time. But now it's gotten to the point where it's in your phone, and they're looking at discontinuing the iPod line because it's all sort of become this one integrated thing.
Well, it's incredible, isn't it? Just looking at some of the news feeds, and you see how many young people, are moved by Steve Jobs' passing. They've got iPads, iPhones, they've got iPods, but you nailed it, Ben. I mean, can anyone who's young imagine, having not being able to carry around their music collection?
Well, just imagine they were carrying around, CD Walkmans, or that would jitter every time you hit a bump or something, and now now it's you wouldn't even dream of that now.
No, and it's interesting, and probably, we're very lucky that just the convergence of technology occurred right as Steve Jobs, could realise a lot of his vision. People, say, well, what now? Well, I'm sure there's a lot of plans and a lot of good ideas, but he's shown a whole company how to create new products and how to design them properly, which is something that the rest of the PC world has never achieved in 40 years, and by the looks of it, never will.
Yeah, and I think that's where it should become interesting as far as Apple's future, given that he's no longer there to sort of like put that little bit of gold on top of whatever they're designing. The question will be if they're probably in the near term, 5 years, they've probably already planned out everything. So it's really what happens after that, whether they continue to innovate and be that leader that they were. And the argument is that because he was kind of like the soul of that company, that Apple just won't have that sort of X factor going forward.
But wasn't he famous for saying or something like, you see 1,000 things, it's your ability to say no to 999 of them, or something along those lines, and choose the one thing. And I think that underlines that he didn't individually make, the iPad, or he didn't individually make the iPhone, but he was able to tell the people within his company, which bits were the right bits to put together.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the guy's strength was, and obviously, he could dream, he could envisage the future. And the other thing that he said was, I think, once something that you can't design anything by a focus group, or people can't tell you what they want. You have to give them what they want.
Yeah. And that's a very, very bold way of going about your business. And obviously, he's been vindicated in that, Apple is, the top tech company and the leader in the market, and at times was the most valuable company in the world.
Yeah, it's incredible, mate. Incredible that he did all of that out of the garage.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we might finish up there. It's good to reflect on Steve Jobs and everything that he's brought to the table, so to speak. I know that you and I both appreciate and have benefited from a lot of the products that he's created.
Absolutely. I don't know how I could have done half of the things that I have achieved, in terms of filmmaking without Apple.
Absolutely. So thanks again, Steve, for chipping in for today, and we'll be back early next week to talk about the new iPhone and how it measures up with everything else. So until then, we'll catch you then.